Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. For several years running, California voters, when polled, have stated that housing is the #1 issue confronting the state. To address this concern, the state provides key housing information to local governments, referred to as a housing needs assessment, to guide local efforts to ensure that they're planning for enough housing. Of course, that guidance is only good as the data that supports it. A recent review by the state auditor indicates there may be some problems in that regard. Our guest is Christopher Elmendorf. He's the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law at UC Davis. And he co-authored a report reviewing California's process for determining and accommodating regional housing needs that informed the state auditor's report. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thanks. It's really great to be here.
So before we get started with talking about your findings, I thought it might be helpful to kind of talk about some of the key basic information. So, for example, what is a housing needs assessment?
That's a great question. So every 8 years, the state undertakes to determine on a regional basis, that is not looking at one city in isolation, but every city that's part of a connected region. The state tries to figure out how many new units of housing that region will need over the next 8 years to accommodate people in the region, and people who are there now and people who might move there in the future. And that's called a regional housing needs assessment or regional housing needs determination. And then once the state makes that determination, a council of local governments, you can think of this as like the United Nations of local governments within the region. They get together and they divvy up the number, and each local government gets a target. And then that target becomes the basis for something that's called the housing element of the general plan, which is a document that the city adopts and that guides the city's actions for the next 8 years.
Okay, so it's done about every 8-10 years?
Roughly every 8 years, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the state's housing needs assessments. What are the key components that make up that assessment?
So historically, the assessment was based on forecasted household growth. So the State Department of Finance makes projections about how many households are likely to form within a region. That includes both young people forming their own households and new people moving into the region from outside. And then that number becomes the basis for the determination of how many new units of housing the region needs. In this new planning period, or the current planning period, the state changed the methodology to try to better account for present needs as well as the needs of future households. And so there are additional adjustments that are made to account for things like vacancy rates and overcrowding and the share of households that are paying a high proportion of their income in rent or for a mortgage.
Yeah, a lot of moving targets there. So you got the COG, which is, I really like the way you describe that as kind of the United Nations for local government. It's a great way to kind of capture what that is, because, for example, in Fresno County, we have a COG, and what they have is, the small cities and the big cities, it's Clovis and Fresno, plus all the smaller cities too are all part of that. And then generally, COG though has been really known for dealing with transportation dollars, but they're also dealing with this housing element as well. So, what are the COGs and the local government supposed to do after the state, completes this housing needs assessment? What do they do with it? Put it on the shelf, or do they really use it?
Right. So they use it. The United Nations meets and they divvy up the housing target among each city and county in the region, and then that target becomes the basis for a plan called the housing element that each city must individually adopt and have reviewed by the State Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD. And HCD says, yep, that's pretty good. We'll sign off on that plan. Or they say, no, we don't think that plan is going to work. And they send it back to the city to come up with a new plan.
And you've done other research. This current research follows on other research you've done in the past when it comes to this issue. I'm just wondering, what did you find in earlier research when you're looking at this?
So from a really big picture perspective, there have been three pretty fundamental problems with the California framework. And it shouldn't come as any surprise that there are pretty fundamental problems with the framework, because this framework has been on the books in its current form since 1980, and in previous forms going all the way back to 1968. And while this framework has been in place, California has gone from having housing that's a little bit more expensive than most other parts of the country to housing that's way out of line with housing prices in the rest of the country. So the bottom line is it hasn't really worked as well as people had hoped. And the question is why? And there are at least three pretty deep problems with the way the framework has been implemented historically. One problem is that the forecasted future households definition of need ignores the fact that where prices and rents are very high, the forecasted number of households is lower precisely because of high prices.
Right, you'd expect that.
It's no secret the middle class people are leaving California in droves for Texas and Arizona and other places with more affordable housing. California lost a congressional district for the first time. So the forecasted households definition of need is a limitation. A second problem is that the framework has assumed that the only way to create a new or an available unit of housing for a middle income or a lower income household is to build a new unit of housing for that household. When the reality is that the way the market operates, when you build new expensive housing that may not be affordable directly to a middle income household, somebody who's moving into that house is vacating another house. And there's this connection of chains of moves that occur every time new housing opens in a region.
We've only about 10 seconds left. What's the third one?
The third problem is that the housing elements have assumed that every site that could be developed in the next 8 years will be developed.
Okay, well, there's an assumption that may not be true. We're going to continue this conversation on the other side. This is Mark Keppler with the Maddy Report. Welcome back. This is Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Christopher Elmendorf. He's the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law at UC Davis about the state's regional needs, housing needs assessments, and whether they really do a good job of informing local governments about their needs to plan for future housing. You know, one thing you review were the limitations in the state process in terms of estimating, allocating, and planning regional housing needs. What were your findings?
Okay, so to summarize briefly, one problem is that the state's projection of need is based solely on, or at least historically has been based solely on the number of expected households in the future. And that doesn't account for the fact that places that don't have enough housing also have low rates of household growth. A second problem is that the state doesn't account for the effect of new market rate housing or its absence on the availability of more affordable housing elsewhere in the region. And finally, the third problem is that when cities adopt their housing plans, they assume that every site that could, in theory, be developed will in fact be developed over the next 8 years.
Yes, some assumptions that may not be correct. So let me ask you this. You also analyze what the legislature is doing to improve the process. What'd you find there?
So the two most important reforms that the legislature adopted in the last few years were first a bill called Senate Bill 828 that requires the projected future households definition of need to be adjusted to account for present needs, including vacancy rates, overcrowding, cost-burdened households. And that has resulted in housing targets for the expensive regions, Los Angeles and San Francisco primarily, that are 2 to 3 times as large as they were in previous planning periods. A second important adjustment is that the legislature told cities that when they're planning for new housing on sites there's already an existing use, like maybe it's a gas station or maybe it's a warehouse or something else.
Well, they were talking about repurposing malls these days.
Yeah, you need to make some adjustment for market conditions and development trends. You can't just assume that all of those sites will be developed just because there's a theoretical possibility of development. And different cities are implementing that new law in different ways, but it's resulting in more realistic housing plans on balance.
Okay. So you also studied how well the State Department of Housing and Community Development implemented the new criteria. I'm wondering, how did they do? What you're a professor, what grade are you going to give them?
Oh, I'd give them a B+ or an A-.
Okay.
Not bad, and I don't do great inflation, so I think that's actually pretty good. They were operating under a really tight timeline. Senate Bill 828 is passed in 2018. They've got to get the new numbers out the next year to give the regional governments a little time to plan. And there were some oversights. I think probably the most significant is that they didn't make any adjustment for jobs, housing, and balance, which is one of the factors that should have been used and would have resulted in probably a higher target for the San Francisco area and a somewhat lower target for the Central Valley communities. And there were other assumptions that they made that you can quibble with, but given the press of time and given the level of in-house expertise, I think they did. They got the gist of what the legislature wanted, which was housing targets that account in some, back of the envelope way for present needs.
I know UC Davis Law School is a very, very good law school. So if you're giving them a B+ or A-, that I'd take that. So that's pretty good. So up next, we're going to talk about the consequences of the state aiming too high or too low when it comes to regional housing needs. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with UC Davis law professor Chris Elmendorf about a report he co-authored about the state's process for determining and accommodating regional housing needs. So I was going to say, why are we talking about this? Why is this important? When they set the target too high or too low, what are the implications?
Okay, well, so I think everybody knows that California has a shortage of housing, and that should indicate to you that if we set the target too low, we have a problem. And that we're not dealing with a shortage. As for what happens if the target gets set too high, cities have to do a lot of rezoning that they might not otherwise want to do. But the state provides planning grants so that cities aren't spending a lot of money out of pocket on that rezoning. And ultimately, if the city rezones and there's not demand for housing, then housing won't get built. But the city won't suffer any tangible harms in any other way either. The most tangible consequence for a city is that if it's not making adequate progress towards its housing targets, it has to permit certain housing projects that use union labor and that have a bunch of affordable housing units as part of the project through a ministerial process, meaning the city doesn't have a lot of discretion to
and the whole issue of local control and Sacramento providing dictates to local communities, and you get all into all of that. So yeah, some big implications. Another thing they talk about in these reports is something called a healthy vacancy rate. How's that defined, and what's the problem with that, or is there a problem with that?
So it's defined very vaguely. A healthy vacancy rate is one that is appropriate for healthy housing markets and regional mobility. And the statute as well says that for rental housing, HCD may not presume a vacancy rate that's healthy below 5%. So there's a 5% floor in the statute.
And then where they picked up the 5% number, we really don't know, but it's 5%.
Yeah, it's not wildly out of keeping with what's true of rental housing generally. Okay. But in general, if you have a higher vacancy rate, that's going to put downward pressure on prices. And if you have a very low vacancy rate, that's going to put upward pressure on prices. So if housing prices are really high, it makes sense to target a somewhat higher than typical vacancy rate.
Yeah. So they also got the COGS involved that we talked about before, which again, I really like your definition of the United Nations of Local Governments. Great description of what a Council of Governments is. But they are also dealing with this and determining, what the housing needs are in their area. And they come up with something called comparable regions. So comps, they're looking at what regions are like us and how are we stacking up. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, where do they find these comps? How do they decide? Is it by geography, by location?
So this is a new factor in the statute, and comparable region is not defined. And different councils of governments used very different approaches to selecting comparables. Many of them seem to try to pick regions that had actually similar vacancy rates, similar rates of overcrowding. And thus, you could say through the selection of comparables, tried to gerrymander their way out of a large housing target. And the state auditor called this out in the case of Santa Barbara, I think fairly. And for some regions, like the Southern California region, including Los Angeles, HCD said no, we're going to require you to use sort of a nationally representative set of cities as the comparable. But for other jurisdictions or other regions, again, like Santa Barbara and the Bay Area, HCD cut the local government some slack and let them choose maybe suspect comparables.
I'm going to clean up this quote, and I think it's attributable to Mark Twain, but I think he said there are lies, darn lies, and statistics in that order. And so you can manipulate the numbers to give you the result that you want. Last thing I want to talk to you about was something you were kind of referred to, we've talked earlier, and that is maybe the state auditor really missed the point here in terms of thinking about how do we get to the right number, because there really is no right number. In fact, you did a tweet on this, and someone responded to your tweet, which is interesting. They said, it seems like the state auditor is kind of sweating the small stuff. So what are your concerns here? What did the state auditor miss?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. The big picture is that we have a governor who ran on a platform of we need to make up a 2.5 million home shortage. And we have independent estimates of the housing shortage that are widely variable, maybe 1 million units at the low end, maybe 3 million units at the upper end. All of those estimates rely on different assumptions and many grains of salt. HCD came up with numbers that are in the low to middle range of that broad range of independent estimates. And that was just missing from the auditor's report, right? That there's ultimately a lot of different assumptions that have to be made with varying degrees of reasonableness. And at the end of the day,
and sometimes we have a problem. So we're running up against the deadline here. I really want to thank Chris Elmendorf of the UC Davis for being with us. Up next, we're going to talk to Dan Dunmoyer with the California Building Industry Association about what the housing industry thinks about all of this. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. Our next guest is Dan Dunmoyer. He is the president and CEO of the California Building Industry Association, the leading voice for the state home building industry. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Great to be here. Thanks again, Mark.
So listen, we've been talking about the state's housing needs assessments and the way that it kind of tells local governments how to follow and implement housing policy to ensure that it meets the state's housing needs. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that process and about the results. Is it helping or hurting?
Well, it does help for a couple key reasons. It reminds us, as you noted, that we have a housing crisis, and it reminds local governments that they need to provide leadership within their communities to make it easier to find ways to build more homes. So that for that part of the purpose of what's called RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, it's a useful tool to remind local governments that they need to step up and be people who support more homes versus less homes.
So the state has been looking. This has been a topic A for forever. It seems like housing affordability in California, and I'm just wondering, what do you think about the state's actions, both the governor and the legislature, when it comes to addressing this problem of housing affordability in California? Are there things that you particularly like or dislike?
Well, I like the fact that we're talking about it. Half of moving a policy agenda is getting policymakers to talk about an issue. So that half, we have a lot of good rhetoric, and I use the word loosely and not negatively. So having political leaders, the governor, legislative leaders, both parties talking about the importance of addressing our housing crisis is very important. But to the other half of your question, there's a lot of talk, a lot of bills, but not a lot of change in how we try to build homes at a better price and more quickly. That process hasn't improved in the last decade, and that's why we're still facing a housing crisis, Mark.
Is there something, I'm going to give you a chance here to say there's something you particularly said, the legislature, they're trying to aim at B, but they missed the target, or A, they missed the target. Is there something they've done, or the governor's done, that you said that really doesn't help solve the problem?
Yeah, it's a balance of trying to find the sweet spot between saving our planet from a climate perspective, but also coming forward with legislative solutions. So many times when a governor comes forward with an idea on how we can reduce greenhouse gas, he doesn't take into account that not all the technology that's needed to achieve those goals is available today. It will be available in 15 years. It's not available today, and yet some of the regulations require us as soon as January 1st of next year, 2023, to come forward with solutions to problems that have yet to be solved. And that's part of this issue, is finding what I call the sweet spot. We do build the most energy efficient, seismic safe, fire safe homes in the world. Well, can we do better? Of course we can. But can we do better instantly? No, we need a few years. So it's a transition between ideation to solution. And that's at times where the governor or the legislature as a whole gets ahead of themselves with great ambition but not really the steps to get to achieve that ambition.
So what do you want to see them do? I mean, you could say secret reform, that's always out there. Maybe that's a pie in the sky wish list. I don't know. But there was some movement a few years ago that people were actually going to try to address CEQA, do some reform in that area. It didn't really happen. Is there something you'd like to see the governor and legislature do?
Yeah, a couple of things. CEQA reform would be a great place to start. Again, we don't have to get rid of CEQA. We should protect our environment, but you can do CEQA 20 times on a project. So let's do CEQA once. Let's bring all the stakeholders to the table, the environmentalists, labor, building community, the neighbors, and go through it and fix it and then build. So that's one simple step, which doesn't get rid of CEQA. It just fixes it so it's more workable. But the other component is just how long it takes. We started on the local government issue. How long it takes for local government to get to yes. It takes decades in this state, Mark. And it takes weeks or maybe months in all the neighboring states, whether they're Democrat or Republican states. You can build a home in Democrat Nevada or Republican Arizona 10 times faster than California. And that's a California problem.
Yeah, and time is money. I mean, and then let's get to that issue of, is the problem with California housing really market driven? The cost of money and loans, land, labor, at rest. Is that really what's driving the problem here? And are we going to see more, multifamily housing in the future, California? Less of the suburban, one home on one house on a piece of property, but rather multi-family kind of situations.
Well, to build a home in this state only costs about 5 or 10% more than it does in Nevada or Arizona. So the home itself, there's not much difference in price. A little bit higher in cost of labor, but it's the cost of land that's 10 times or 15 times higher. And that's because of the time, that money is time, as you said, and time is money. And so that's the distinction. And then the fees, California fees are 10, 20, 30 times higher than neighboring states. Those two issues have to change to address affordability. To multifamily versus single family, Mark, right now, post-pandemic, people still want a single-family home with a backyard because if they're going to have to stay home, they want to play. So
yeah, one of the things but it's so expensive. One of the things you can think about is maybe a way for people to build equity is to start, in one of these multifamily condo situation and then move up once they build equity to a single-family home, and that's the goal. Well, I want to thank our guest Dan Dunmoyer with the California Building Industry Association for joining us. If you want to stay current on state and local politics, why don't you check out our website at maddyinstitute.com. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Institute. Thank you for joining us. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.